A história do planeta está sendo escrita todos os dias. Só que ela está ficando quente demais. O aquecimento global é um fato. Mas também é um fato que estamos escrevendo essa história. E ela pode ser diferente. A JBS, uma das maiores produtoras de alimentos do mundo, apresentou um compromisso global. JBS Net Zero. Até 2040, ano após ano, ela vai melhorar ainda mais o jeito que produz, com 100% de energia limpa e reduzindo emissões de gases de efeito estufa. Hoje, a JBS já exige desmatamento ilegal zero e monitora todos os seus fornecedores. Até quem vende para eles começou a ser também. E vai ter muito investimento em ciência para criar novas tecnologias. Não vai ser fácil, mas será feito. Para tudo isso sair do papel. JBS. Alimentar a mudança é o nosso compromisso.
Care is protecting a way of life for generations.
Care is taking action on behalf of fairness and sustainability.
Bringing passion to everything you do.
Care is a service to our communities, our environments.
Proving good taste and good values go hand in hand.
Because together we're stronger.
Care is what goes into every single cup of Nespresso.
Nespresso. What else?
Boa tarde a todos. Bem-vindos a mais um evento especial Coalizão Brasil para a COP26, um projeto realizado em parceria com o Valor Econômico e a Coalizão Brasil, Clima, Floresta e Agricultura, que tem o objetivo de ampliar o conhecimento sobre a COP26, em especial sobre o Acordo de Paris, e identificar os riscos e oportunidades que as mudanças climáticas trazem para o uso da terra no Brasil. O projeto ele se divide em 6 encontros virtuais.
It consists of 6 virtual events, gathering authorities and professionals to debate the environment and the weather and the climate, and the monthly debates that can bring consciousness and awareness to society in this regard, all before the convention in Glasgow. I am Juliana Lopes, Director of SEG, and I have coordinated the UN Global Pact of UN, and I am a member of the Executive Coalition Group today. Today, I am mediating this debate in regard to the Paris Agreement and the opportunities to integrate the agribusiness production. And I share this task with Fernando Lopes, who is the Valor Econômico editor.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Juliana. It's cold afternoon in São Paulo. We're below 10 degrees, so this live is going to be good to warm up our spirits today. So this is the 4th event of this series. I had the pleasure to join the 3rd live session last month. Also with Marcelo Brito, we discussed the role of the private sector in the changes, the structural changes, in looking for a more sustainable model. And I do believe we have the chance to discuss a very important point today. Like, all the projections indicate our agricultural and livestock production will continually grow in the next 10 to 30 years. And we know that the Cerrado is an important stage for this growth. So we'll be discussing ways on how this growth has to be, it can be sustainable over the next few years, preferably with the reduction of gases emissions, etc. So we have a lot to discuss. Master sponsorship of the 6 Lives is by JBS, and it's Libra 2040. We are aware that JBS is one of the largest animal protein companies in the world, established 2040 as a goal to zero their carbon emissions. And from this live, we also have the support of Nespresso. Good afternoon. Good debate, everyone. Juliana, back to you.
Thank you, Fernando. Without a doubt, this is a very important discussion for our country, and the contribution of experts that we have in this theme will make the whole difference. Among all the guests that we have today, those who are going to be talking to us, we have Ludmila Radis. She is a biologist. She is a PhD in ecology through Unicamp. She is also a scientist for Woodwell Climate Research Center in the United States, and she's also a member of IPAN, Instituto de Pesquisa Ambiental. and her focus of study is on the effects of changes at a local perspective with agribusiness production and strategies for mitigation of problems. We also have Aurelio Pavinato. He holds a master's degree and a PhD in agribusiness, in soil science, and he has participated in many events in Brazil. And we also have André Nassar. He is the current president of the ABIOVE, Brazilian Association of Vegetable Oil and Industry. He is the former Secretary of Agricultural Policy for MAPA and former president of Embrapa's Board of Directors. It is an honor to share this opportunity with you. But before we start talking about this, we had already agreed that each one's going to speak a little bit. So I'd like to invite Ludmila to introduce the theme, and then we are going to listen to the next guests. Ludmila, welcome. Thank you, Juliana. I'd like to thank for the invitation received from Valor Econômico and the invitation from Coalition to take part in this webinar. It's a pleasure to be here among colleagues, Juliana and Fernando and others. It is a pleasure to talk about this and to conciliate the agricultural production and talk about the Cerrado, which is a very diverse biome. Well, okay, conciliating conservation and production require very integrated responses and scientific information so that the use can be very responsible. We cannot make mistakes with the Cerrado because it's hard to know how to recover this, and the agriculture production cannot be stopped. Most of the Brazilian production comes from this area. Making a mistake with the Cerrado is going to put the country at risk. We are talking about one of the most ancient biomes in the world. To get to these very profound soils and to get to this geological formation that we have now in this area, the rain that falls over the Cerrado, along with the native forest that we have there, it creates a very specific biological scenario. What happened with the current basin river since 2018, the agricultural area has increased more than 6 times, and the central areas of plantation have also increased in this same period. This agricultural expansion has brought problems of developments in the south part of Bahia and in other regions. And according to ANA, the National Water Agency, the region of Matopiba that encompasses Bahia, Maranhão state, has increased to around 1,800 hectares of agribusiness area. Between 1986 and 2018, the flow of the Pratudão River has reduced 38%. We use a coefficient of surface index that makes a correlation between the land and the precipitation. In 2015, the index went up to 0.2. It means that the total of the rain that precipitates of there became water in the river flow, and that has decreased in 2015. And what happens? Some studies in regard to the San Francisco Basin, they mention that everything that happens because of soil change. Some others attribute these to climate changes, especially because of the dimension of precipitation. This impacts the agriculture because it depends on rain, but it also affects the irrigated agriculture because it decreases the water support, and it affects the energy matrix in the country. The deforestation in the Cerrado makes the temperature increase and humidity to decrease. we have seen that every 25 hectares of native land that is removed to be replaced into pastures makes the temperature increase as well. We are now facing some problems, some technical problems with the.
We're facing technical issues with Ludmila.
For corn, things are even more dramatic because there are going to be 2 bags less because of the dryness, and 17 bags less, even more if it gets drier, and it's not sustainable. But there is a solution to it. Agriculture can be a very good water producer in the country. That depends on the way we produce things. We need to reduce deforestation because we're still facing high numbers, a lot of degradation of land, and we need to improve the management of practices of areas that are legally converted. We need to include social aspects of land management. There's also a study that was carried out by IPAN that shows the evapotranspiration that leaves the water that leaves the soil in evaporation is equivalent to the other area. We can you work with intercrops if we manage water in soil. This is of urgent matter, and we know what has been happening, but we also need to invest in mitigation. Our contribution to manage global climate change is difficult, but we have the sovereignty to work with nature soil conservation. I'd like to close my speech talking about how much we need to invest in mitigation and in a way that we have less events of hot moments and mini summers, as we say, and we need to work on prevention. Thank you, Juliana. Now I'm going to give the floor to Aurelio. Aurelio, you have the floor. Feel free.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me, Juliana, Fernando, the Valor newspaper, and the coalition. It's a pleasure to join this discussion, this debate. This is so important because I see that, in my opinion, I mean, we have two issues in the world in order to manage in the planet. The first is controlling global warming. It is a challenge for every country in the world, and Brazil is obviously included in this scenario. And today's discussion is going to be around this topic because every climate events we have in the environments, as Ludmila said, they are a consequence of a macro change that happens in the world. The climate volatilities, we know that the primary source of energy is solar energy. The higher the warming in terms of planet, the higher is the intensity that we see. Intense rains, intense droughts, intense heat, intense cold. The intensity of events uh, that happen do impact regions of the planet according to the place. So this is the challenge we have as planet's population. That's why I want to connect the discussion to our Cerrado, the role Cerrado plays within this global warming issue. Secondly, the other challenge we have as a population is to produce food for the number of people we have today. So we cannot discuss one problem disconnected from the other one. Let's reforest the product, and we're going to plant less. How are we going to feed this population? So when I see the size of our population and the growth we had over the last 40 years, this is great information. We have doubled population, the world population, from 4 to nearly 8 billion people in the world. The United Nations forecasts will be nearly people, 10 billion people in the world. So over the next 30 years, we're gonna have like, well, 30 years, we're gonna have 63 more million people in the world every year. So if you do the math of the number of grains in the planet, 3.3 billion tons of grains today, which counts for 433 kilos per capita of grain production in the world over the next 30 years. We, if we keep the growth as it is over the last 40 years, grew by 1.8% a year, the demand per grains. So if we keep growing 1.8% over the next few years, we're going to need every year of 60 million tons additionally of grains. According to FAO studies, Brazil will be responsible for nearly 40% of that expansion in terms of production. So from 60 million, 24 million will be additional that Brazil should produce in the next years. When we analyze that Brazil today produces 260, 270 million, depending on the climate, like the way it was this year. So over the next 10 years, we should play a role of increasing our production by at least 240 tons to to comply with this um, information. I know that a map does not project all that, but the world will demand such production. And Brazil today, since it is a high exporter of food, we should get ready to comply with this demand. That's why I say we have two challenges to face. When I see the Brazilian Cerrado and its capacity to produce food and supply food, I compare this national and worldwide information when I consider the world production and I divide by the world planted area, 923 million hectares, 3.6 tons of hectares by hectare, I mean. So when we see the total production split by the planted area with grains, we have now 48, 49,000. I have two harvests. I produce two times in the same land, so 5.5 tons per hectare. Brazil is much more efficient in production because we produce 5.5 tons of grains compared to the world that on average produces 3.6, 3.3. When I look at the Cerrado, we had two harvests. Nearly two-thirds of the area that was planted in the Cerrado this number will go up to 6.57 tons of production of grains. With a potential, when I look at the potential we have in the Cerrado, it is even higher. We can produce soy like 4.5 kilos per hectare. We produce corn, produce 8,000 kilos per hectare. So you can produce 12, 13,000 kilos per hectare. So the Cerrado in Brazil plays a national role, an international role, to get to produce a lot in the same hectare and comply with the world demand for food. When I connect that information, how much of the Cerrado we can use today for agropecuary production? Cerrado is one-fourth of Brazil. We have 204 million hectares. Out of those 104 million hectares, 111 million are native forest, and 60 million is pastures. So today we have around 25 million hectares cultivated with annual crops, and that we will have in the Cerrado region. It's a proportion; it's pretty small out of the total area of 204 million hectares. I said that the world will demand more food, and Brazil will play an important role while supplying food, and so will the Cerrado. What is the potential we have to expand this production in the next decades? When I see the pasture land, that's the natural path. The natural path is not expanding on native reforestation because of Embrapa's official data. We would have nearly 30 million hectares of pastures. It was made by agroeconomy. Nearly 30 million hectares of areas that are being used as pastures or other uses that can be converted to produce annual crops. And there are other 50 million hectares or 16 that are native forest and have a potential for agricultural production. In our view, Brazil does not need to use those those native vegetation areas to expand our production. We can expand our production by using pasture areas because we have degraded pasture areas today. They have a low carbon stock. When you convert this pasture area for production areas, which intensively with 2 crops a year, coverage, we can produce a lot of food over the next decades, and we can also compensate carbon, which is to contemplate the emission, the avoid emission. And when I get all this, when I match all this to global warming, family agriculture, 11.8% of gas emission, 73% of emissions are provoked by non-renewable energy sources that are used. So the planet, if the planet does not want to warm itself anymore, we should change our energy sources. The main countries should change their energy sources. But the Brazilian agriculture represents 1%. Since the Cerrado is nearly 50% of Brazilian agricultural production, so I estimate that in the Cerrado region, we will have emissions of nearly 0.5% of the greenhouse gas emissions. So we play a role, but it is a small magnitude role when we think of emissions. And the question remains, how important is this region to reduce global warming in the next decades? It does have an important role because today we manage soil very sustainably in the Cerrado. We that operate that region, we have now 22 farms of the company. We know that as years go by, we increase the level of carbon in the soil, not otherwise. We can intensify this in the next few years. Cerrado can play a stronger and stronger role, and we can sequester carbon and contribute with with fighting against global warming. And we can convert pastures and sequester carbon. So I do see that both challenges, they do not conflict against each other. We can produce more over the next few decades, and we can conserve the protective system, and we should avoid expansion to new agricultural frontiers. And why? Because then there's a technological point. The tech evolution needs to be able to supply the world via productivity growth, not planet area expansion. This is our challenge in the Brazilian Cerrado. We should double the production over the next 10 years without putting one tree down. At our company, at SLC, we're not going to expand our operations to native vegetation areas. We're going to go towards converted areas. So within this view, that it is possible for us to reach a higher objective to produce more and conserve the environment. So this is my first talk on the topic. Here are 2 challenges for us to think about, and we can discuss later, and have our colleagues talks as well. Thanks, Juliana. Thanks, Fernando.
Thank you very much, Aurelio. Great words. I think we are going to have a lot of questions further on. I now give the floor to André. You have a few minutes here to talk.
Good afternoon, Juliana. Good afternoon, Fernando. Thank you, Valor and Coalition, for having me. I would also like to greet Ludmila and Aurelio. It is great to debate with you guys. I like what Ludmila said, the view that agriculture itself needs to have a number of practices that will mitigate the climate effects. Otherwise, climate will turn against agriculture. And I like what Aurelio said that Brazil does play a role. The Cerrado plays a role in production, in supply, in food production. It's pretty large, especially developing those technologies that save climate impact. So Brazil is in this frontier, and we do need we need to play our leadership role. Now, as a representative of what we call the soy industry, we do have this issue. I mean, it is a quality, but it is hard for you to balance both sides, which is understanding the producer's view because we buy from the producers, and then we trade, we export, and the view of our own consumer. And these views still are still far apart. They still need to be conciliated. So we live on a daily fight on how to explain to the consumer that what is said, what the consumer says, actually actually makes clear that the consumer is not aware of what happens in Brazil's agriculture, and how to tell the producer that they should account for the market evolution with new demands, which is going to impact the productive system. So we have to match those points constantly, and they usually they go against each other. I mean, there are some cues for us to follow. In my view, when we consider the consolidated agriculture of the Cerrado, that is great. The issue of soil conservation, the issue of permanent preservation areas, the capacity, the adaptive capacity of the producers. We had serious drought problems in the Mato Pipa region a few years ago, and producers used new practices that increased the resilience of the soil production there. And there's Mato Grosso and so on. But now there's the whole deforestation point. I'd like to comment on what Ludmila said. On my first talk, I'll be speaking about big numbers, and then we can go into the breakdown of the whole thing. Nearly half of the Cerrado is taken, but there are numbers that haven't been mentioned, and we should mention here. Nearly 19 million hectares is soy. Like the number I have here is 96 million hectares in the Cerrado. This can be a bit more, but anyways, nearly 19 million hectares are soy, and 77 million hectares are other uses. That's the analysis we did at Biome. Now, out of those 77, 44 million hectares are taken by pastures and farms that have no evident soil, altitude, and climate restrictions for soy. So, out of 77 million hectares that are not occupied by soy but have been worked on, 44% are taken by yearly crops or even temporary crops. Most of them are a bunch of them are taken by pastures, even because of the number that already commented. The Cerrado has nearly 25 million hectares of crops. So if you eliminate that, if you deduct that, we have soy. So that's the number that we should discuss. 33 million out of 44 to 77, there's 33, right? 33 million are not able for yearly crops. So a huge volume of Cerrado was open that is not able to produce crops on a yearly basis. Of course, we have to lever that area from the production standpoint. So either with pasture or some kind of constant crop, but it's a big challenge. So that model we have to look from now onwards. Opening Cerrado should not happen in areas that are not able for able to have high productivity crops. Because if we include low productivity, we will be committing a mistake. Because here's another interesting figure: nearly 100 million of Cerrado is open. If I consider 2001 to date, 30 million hectares were open after 2001. That is, nearly 70 million were open before 2001, right? The bulk of what was open in the Cerrado, it dates before 2001, when we could say that there was no technology, there was no knowledge whatsoever to understand. Okay, now the we see that it is decreasing. How open it is, I mean, we still have a reasonable value, nearly 700,000 hectares a year. Now, today we do have technology, but if we have to open, and then we can discuss the issue of legality, in my opinion, we have to open to have high productivity, not to low productivity activities anymore. So we should find a way out, because this changes the legal issue. Every producer can open areas. Now, is it correct to open areas that are not going to be productive later? In my understanding, as an agronomer, I don't accept that. I don't buy that solution. Okay, as a technician, I would never accept that solution. Now, that's the connection I want to make with soy, and I'll be wrapping up. Out of those 28.5 million hectares that were open in 2001 to date, 20% was occupied by soy. So if I consider soy today, rewind all the way back to 2001, we will see that out of the 18.8 million hectares of soy, 15 and a half occupied open areas before 2001, and 3.8 occupied open areas after 2001. So, in the whole daily Cerrado opening dynamics, soy took over 20% of that. So there's 80% that is being occupied by other activities. Part of it, as I said, I don't know the exact figure, was areas that are not able for crops. So that's where the problem lies. Of course, soy is a vector of Cerrado opening, yes, but it opens areas that are able. We do not see, I mean, we have seen in some cases until 10 years. We haven't seen this in 10 years' time. I already can confirm that for me, but I haven't seen any Cerrado opening for grains, for soy. That is not an able area. But we have an issue here. Many areas are being opened to Cerrado. I'm not sure if this may be theory here, but it's a waste. You open areas without needing to open them. So that's what we have to discuss. How can we work as a producer? How can we act as producers in industries, analyzing those that buy and also inputs, and the whole civil society, with the way you can pressure and study, because civil society today is a source of study, especially even more than academia. So how can we solve that point? How can we have this whole dynamics of opening of the Cerrado that still opens areas that are not able, and opens areas for crops that are not the main objective of the Cerrado? There are other things occupying that area, not necessarily with higher productivity. So we have to tackle that. This is going to generate the deforestation of Cerrado. Is this going to save the issue that Ludmila brought up? Not really, but it's going to reduce a lot. We still have many hectares of Cerrado being open every year, but it is being open, according to the figures, for activities that are not going to be high productivity activities. That's why I think we have to act upon as a chain. Finally, of course, we know the contribution of soy, that, but zero soy deforestation is not going to solve the 700,000 hectares. So we know we need soy with zero deforestation, nearly probably coming from Amazon and Cerrado. We know we have to deal with that. As I said in the beginning, we have this pressure coming from the consumer and the whole issue of development and growth and equality of the producer. We have to deal with it, but it is a greater debate. The Cerrado deforestation is not limited to soy, but also to the opening of areas for not that productive uses. This is something we don't accept anymore. Thank you. Let's debate very well.
Thank you, Andre. Well, I think you have noticed that the discussion is going to be really hard. So we are going to a first round of questions coming from the audience, and then we first going to have some questions from all the guests all together, and then some from the audience. We have already received some of the questions. And if you feel really itchy to ask your question, please, you are invited to take part of this. Let me use this moment and ask the first question to Andre. Andre, you have just spoken, but you're going to answer the first question. You started your speech by saying that we are receiving shocks from all of the sides, from the producers, from the consumer markets, and you concluded your speech saying that it is important to work towards convergence. How are we going to deliver results and have a production that is an ally of the the environment in a contribution so that the planet does not has a 1 degree increase in temperature? When we look at this structure, and now we are now talking about actions only, and they are not going to be the solution alone for this opening. We talk about sustainable landscapes. We have to work per sector. Not only that, but also reaching other sectors in order to achieve results. How do you see this as far as the Cerrado is concerned? What are some of the viable recommendations? Thinking of COP26, thinking of the government and everything that the government could be doing, what is a possible suggestion for this?
Well, first off, we need to get to know the territory, right? I'm using a term of those that are well versed. Of course, we know that the territory that is taken by soy. So, just a few more figures, and I'll wrap up with your question. We have nearly 96 properties, rural properties with soy in the Cerrado. They take over 37 million hectares. 18 or 19 million is soy. All those properties have an interesting characteristics because nearly 35% of them are native vegetation. So they have soy and they have a planted area of nearly 19 million hectares with soy. 35% of the total of the 37 million hectares is native vegetation. This is a pretty interesting number. Now, what we see is this native vegetation, part of it can be open legally. Okay. Now, how much of it can be open legally? That's a great volume because the legal reservation in the Cerrado is not 35%. In some states it is, but others it isn't. So the key is to understand how much of the native vegetation can be open legally and is able for production. And that's the plan of that's the whole idea of landscape. How do we get to know producers? We can say producers. You have an area here for soy production, but what is if it isn't able, you cannot open. If it is degraded, we have to recover. That's the kind of debate that we have to go through. In our analysis, nearly 37 million hectares, out of which 19 are soy. About 4.5 billion hectares is native vegetation that is able for soy. So in the farms with soy, in my view, this is the maximum stock. The evolution of soy should, when it comes to Cerrado conversion, it shouldn't be any more than that. Now, for the consumers going to say, well, I don't want you to open 4.5 million. Okay, all right. But It is a coordinated opening with transparency, monitoring, generating information for society, and so on. So we do have a role in the industry to generate information. We should define how the producer is going to use our properties. I mean, there is no way to do that, but generating information and giving transparency, this is critical for us to do. Now, industries are all walking towards traceability and so on. We do have tech to generate information. So my answer to you is we need to generate information and bring this debate of how much we accept in terms of opening, but this is a technical view. It's just what is able to happen now. Now we should enter in the discussion of what was created has to be recovered. Well, I understand that this is a topic for us to work on at Biome. I would like to take the opportunity of what was just said, even considering what André is saying and Ludmila as well. The name of the game is to convert degraded pastures areas for the crops. So this is very important when we talk about the projections of increased land use. Projections show that is an important part of the land that is used by livestock will be converted into agriculture. But this isn't a simple process. I was just interviewing a big producer that's doing this in Mato Grosso on a large area in his farm, and he was just telling me that first he needed the support, he needed financial support, he needed an investment fund that is financing this kind of action. Secondly, he needs technical assistance, specialized assistance to do that kind of conversion, which is not simple at all. There needs to be a company to help him out, and it is costly. We need investments. It isn't as high of a cost as opening a new area, but he estimates that this cost would be like 35 to 40% less, but still, it is an important cost. So I'm talking about this example because this is a pretty interesting model, in my opinion, to try and speed up this conversion process of degraded areas of pastures to agriculture that we don't actually need to deforest native forests, and has a great potential. Now, are public authorities contributing to this with this process? We know that rural technical assistance in Brazil was better, it was broader. There are small producers that complain, but Cerrado is a little different. But what are the paths for us to speed up this process? Fernando, the area conversion is costly. But going back in time a little bit, in the 60s, when I had my master's and PhD, my professor used to say, when he had his master's in America in the 60s, he used to say, well, his professor used to say, the tropical regions are doomed to poverty. And that's the way they were back then. Tropical regions of the planet were very poor because agricultural production would not evolve in tropical regions because there was no technology. In temperate seasons, like the regions, they produce food for people around the world, and those would entail Europe, United States, Eastern Europe, and Russia and Argentina. Even that had to do with the whole condition of the country back then, and tropical regions were doomed to poverty. What happened after that? Brazil has developed technologies to produce in tropical regions. So Brazil is a worldwide success case. The big tropical region in the world is Africa, that doesn't evolve, not for lack of technology, but due to lack of personnel prepared to use technologies, because they exist in Brazil, of skilled people, because the technology exists in Brazil. And throughout the 40 years we've developed the Brazilian Cerrado in grain production, we invested a lot of money, because for you to convert 1 hectare, either Cerrado or pasture, in pastures we invest just a little less, but not that much. because the Brazilian Cerrado soil is poor chemistry wise, because when we had the pasture back in the day, there was no heavy investment, and the name says it all, degraded pastures. So throughout all of those years, it produced in the pastures area without investing in the soil. So today it is a poor soil, as poor as a native Cerrado, maybe even more, because at least the native Cerrado soil has a higher organic level, more carbon. And the degraded soil has level carbon level because it has decomposed throughout the years. Then that requires investment. Now, today, the producer is able to invest because the international market demands our product and pays a higher price to encourage and expand the production. When we see the price of soy in Chicago, $14, what is the message that Chicago sends us and any producer in the world? Plant more soy. I need soy. When the price of the corn is $5 a bag, what is the message that comes? Plant more corn. I need more corn. That's the message. Now, today, the private system, the whole system, public system in Brazil, but also the private one, and the interest rate in Brazil is better. It isn't a limiting factor when it comes to finance and economics for the producer to develop a pasture area and converse that into pasture area. The technological issue, we have evolved a lot today. The Mid-South region has cooperatives, which play a very important role in terms of technical assistance to producers. When I see the evolution of planted area of soy in Brazil, the first state that expanded the most in the last few decades was Mato Grosso, but after Mato Grosso, there's Rio Grande do Sul. It may seem incredible. A large pasture area in the South region was converted into soy, and a large area of rice was converted into soy as well, because Brazil doesn't export rice. Asia produces its own rice. Brazil doesn't export much. We produce for our own consumption. We increased the rice productivity in Brazil. We reduced the area. The planted area has reduced to comply with the domestic demand. So these are factors, funds, and technologies that I don't think they are limiting factors. It is an issue of demand. If we have the demand, and given that the demand exists, the market adapts the price to pay for that cost of development of areas, and then producers are encouraged to expand their production. Perfect. Anyway, Juliana, we see that after Pavinato's response, we answered at least part of a question that was sent by Arthur Chaves de Carvalho. Now, back to you. Do you have any questions? Juliana, please make yourself at home.
Oh, sure. I'm going to ask a question to Ludmila, and then we are going to move to other questions. Uh, uh, they mentioned a lot of mitigation concerns, and you've mentioned that as well. It is a key point. And the question of resilience. When you look at the aspect of the Cerrado and the big technologies that are out there being adopted by the producers, where do you see Brazil has a lot of gain as far as contribution is concerned in reducing the impact of climate changes and gas emissions? When you look towards the academic side of the story and studies, if you could choose two topics, what would those be, Juliana? So maybe Juliana, uh, André may André and Aurelio may contribute, especially because André has a doctorate in soil. We need to look into soil health. We need to look into three important aspects of physical, biological, and chemical quality of soils. We have a peculiarity, and the biomass of Cerrado is very much in the soil, and we need to recover and work on this. Professor Mauricio Querubim from ESALC, he uses these indicators that include these three aspects. There is a special cut on the chemical side of the story, which is very conservationist and integrates the forest and livestock and pasture. They limitate the carbon in soil. In case of a lot of revolvement, we lose a lot of carbon to the atmosphere. And recently, Professor Carlos Serri from ESALC, they carried out some physical analysis of the Mato Piba soil, and they've realized that one of the main bottlenecks is not organic, but physic properties. They are very conservative as far as the use of machines are concerned. But then I am going to touch another point. You've mentioned two aspects. The other aspect that I would like to mention is the native vegetation. I like very much the fact that Andrea brought some numbers to the debate, and he also says there is not a lot of openings of areas with low aptitude. When we analyze to where soil is being expanding, we notice that soil is expanding to marginal areas. And why does that happen? We have to look into topography, we have to look into the quality of soil and the climate. What we are doing as we remove native forests, we are at least touching one of the aspects of this aptitude, which is the climate stability. Studies have shown that 28% of the Brazilian agri-frontier is already out of the optimum of the agriculture that they were in the 70s. They do not have the same characteristics anymore. And maybe we have not noticed that yet so well because the change is not very much into the pluviometric regime, but it is in the atmosphere that is causing the water deficit and dryness. We already owe soil water. So we have to invest into these two fronts: soil health and native vegetation, standing vegetation, that is. Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, Ludmila. Fernando?
Thank you. I would like to pass the floor to Andre. He has spoken about this in his opening remarks. Producers have their needs, and there's the client and their demands as well. So we start to see, especially in these grain trading areas, we see higher requirements and commitments that are signed around the world by big multinational or national players. So we do know of the important role of biome in the soy issue, the zero deforestation in the Amazon, but we see another talk about the soy that comes from the Cerrado. Some products say they want to buy soy in the next few years, also from areas that haven't been deforested either legally or illegally. So the pressure increases. What is the trend? Because at the same time, as you said, we do have a forest code that allows for deforestation. It allows for an area to be deforested in the Cerrado, but there are requirements from the clients as well that many times they don't want either from legally or illegally area. What's the trade? How can we manage that? So the trend, actually, Aurelio talked about this. I mean, it is a trend of, I mean, our consumer market is nearly an elimination of expansion in recently deforested areas. Of course, there is a debate because this topic also entails a commercial aspect. As you know, Fernando, it mixes an ESG issue with commercial. Now, if we're discussing recent deforestation, great. My main concern is when we say, well, let's see 20 years of deforestation. Then there's no way, because 20 years of deforestation is like 20 years ago, there was another reality. But back to your question, Europe has clearly made a decision for those that want to purchase soy and derivatives from areas without deforestation. Europe will follow a legislative path. Markets such as China have turned to traceability to get to know the origin of the production. Now, the effective trend is that nearly all of our soy in a near future, that is not going to be far, in the foreseeable future, it isn't going to be deforested anymore after a certain moment. This moment, we don't know when it's going to happen. Europe wants it to be 2020. Other companies have an commitment for 2025, others for 2030. And some companies have made a commitment for zero deforestation. Companies that have more localized action for 2020. Now, this is happening in production because in our analysis, if you consider the beginning of the 2000s, 30% of the soy expansion was made through deforestation. Now this value is 8%. So the producer himself is more and expends more and more to open areas. And why is that happening? Due to factors that Aurelio brought up. Given the fact that they open more of their areas, because of a change in view, maybe even a lower risk view, as Ludmila said, in some regions that produce soy, the climate has changed, and they become riskier regions, and this prevents you from opening areas in that region. Now, this happens in lower risk areas. The process does happen from the producer side and our consumer side. We just need to make to have those things walk the same speed. I don't think we're going to have soy from the forested area in 5 years' time. So, in my opinion, this is a 5-year scenario. It doesn't mean Cerrado deforestation is going to end. As I said, this is part of it. I mean, the broader debate is going to keep happening. It has to do with government and some other questions on how the government can work. But in terms of soy, I think this has 5 more years, and then we're going to need to work for the producer because you cannot impose things force things. You cannot force things down the producer's throat. It has to be coordinated work. Thank you, Andrea. Juliana, do you have questions from people that are watching us?
Yes, we do have several questions. I am going to start asking you these questions. Andre, you're going to answer the first ones. I know it is hard for us. We only have things on soy and soil, but we have a few questions here because people are trying to understand how the livestock producers can use their pastures without damaging the environment. And how can the sectors work together, especially now when we think that we have a moment for soy, but we also have the moment for livestock farming? So, what are the possibilities that we have there? And if the government needs to be more attentive to it?
Well, in my opinion, in livestock, I'll be speaking about an agronomer. I haven't been an agronomer for a while, but still, I see the livestock is a sector that has been gaining productivity even more than other sectors because it has a great potential of gain. Soy, the physical potential of the physical potential of soy productivity is 2%. If it's in a long-term basis, of course, when you have the second harvest of corn, productivity has grown because you have two crops in the same area, but the productivity gain for livestock is huge. So it is hard for me to see an economic rationale in opening areas for pastures. I struggle to understand that because this is more of intensifying process. The process had to be intensification, and I mean, how is intensification of pasture intensive in capital, in terms of capital? I mean, of money. how can you recover the soil, the production system from an yearly crop? Sometimes it doesn't happen. So there's integration models that Ludmila mentioned. So to my mind, in the specific case of livestock, this has to be solved. How are we going to have the already open areas be more productive? It isn't of everyone's interest because it increases risk, and many times not everyone wants to take risks. They want to have that, you know, guaranteed solution. But in my opinion, for the breeder is gaining by productivity already, but in some regions they are not. So you need to see these regions and work on a more technical, productive view and then we integrate with the grain producer. Then, in my opinion, is a solution. We see large livestock farms. Part is dedicated to crops, and that generated cash for the breeder to work on increased productivity when it comes to livestock. Perfect. Fernando, just one comment on this issue. The extensive livestock has a very high environmental cost because the productivity per hectare is pretty high. That is why the path is the intensification and integration of crop and livestock. That's when you increase the productivity. That's why I agree with Andre that the extensive pecuary doesn't make any sense, in my opinion. Perfect. Well, let me take the opportunity. I have a question here from Roberto Strumpf to Ludmila, and he says, Ludmila, the generation of carbon credit has the potential to increase to speed up the degraded areas production. What are the biggest challenges? How can you overcome them? Just to bring it together to another question, and this is a question that has intrigued me for a while. How can we value the land with vegetation in such a way that it can at least get close to the value of the crude land, for instance? So this imbalance of land, vegetation, and crude land in the Cerrado. This does impact the discussions we are having now. Maybe I'm not sure if this is a standing forest, but actually that's an important issue because if the crude land is worth more, we know what can happen. So here we have two questions, Ludmila. Please, over to you.
So, Fernando, it's like that. We already have a very heated market. People are looking for initiatives to keep the forest really standing, and they are going to be leveraged with the Paris Agreement and the Book of Rules, hopefully out during the Glasgow conference. Studies show that we can increase the production without advancing and destroying vegetation. We have to stop thinking that the areas that are not open are not productive and that do not have any effects. This is some air conditioning that we have installed right in the middle of any property, and they can help locally mitigate impacts of climate that happen globally. There is a heat wave, for example. You have the right to Do you have the right to sell your air conditioning equipment from your home? Yes, of course you do. But is this smart? Now that we are close to having the payment of environmental services in Brazil in place, we need to treat the native vegetation as something that is taking water to the soil, and this is something important for the future, and it is essential for us to increase these 24 million, as Aurelio said, and we can even take part of this market. Brazil is probably the country that can invest the most in the world in nature-based solutions. It's without a doubt the country that has the most potential to invest.
Fernando, can I make a comment here regarding Roberto's question? In my opinion, we have this stock and flow issue, uh, and we don't really value stock. I need to say that we need to find a solution for that. In the flow issue, that's his question, how you guys are going to accumulate carbon. I mean, we recover degraded areas. That's the goal, actually. And in so doing, you accumulate more carbon in the soil. And in so doing, you reduce emissions. Uh, and we see the whole production itself. But this is an important thing because this is worth not only to recover degraded areas. A high production area for soy and corn can recover carbon in the soil as well. It is direct planting, but if there's a whole coverage, you can live in the soil emptiness period. There are many activities that you can do to improve the quantity of carbon in the soil, and you don't do that on a recently deforested area. This has to be worked on for many years. So it is not a favor of consolidated areas. Now, producers, and I think they are right, they talk about the obligation of legal reserve. No one wants to value this stocked carbon. In a scientific view, I understand why nobody values that because there's the difference of stock and flow. But in a practical view, it doesn't make any sense. So this whole combination between when you increase your carbon stock in the soil, but after the flow of our productive activities, you have to value that carbon in the soil, but somehow you value the vegetation that is standing. I don't have a response for that. I think it is up to us to have that debate. And it is worth bringing this to COP on an intelligent way. You can't just say, I did everything I had to do and the rest is wrong. No, in the sense of the science has to evolve because what is everybody's goal? To reduce deforestation. That's the goal. Removing carbon in the soil is this an objective? Yes, but not emitting is also. Both are brothers. You can't tell them apart. Perfect, Juliana.
Wonderful, Andrea. We still have some questions. I'd like to make a little change on the discussion and use one question from Marcos Gando. He says, using this USG moment, what is the financial role in this dynamic? The use of advantages credit for deforestation stopping. How do you see this? Are there special credit lines? How are the producers preparing themselves for that? Is this difficult? Is this complicated? If you could please bring us this panorama.
Perfect, Juliana. The the environmental issue belongs to everyone. It is the field and the city. That is why the whole discussion and the worldwide discussion that we have generates this movement. So, fortunately, today we have a very strong movement of producing sustainably. The zero carbon goal for 2020 for 2050. Actually, it is our challenge as a world population. And then the financial sector plays a very important role of stimulating. I mean, when it finances, it provides green financing and it gets um, interest rate discount through VSG. So they are investing, they are encouraging the investment in practices that generate improvement in ESG aspects. So I see the financial sector is one that has an intermediate role, and it intermediates and it encourages the producer. For us producers, we want a productive system that is totally conservationist, sustainable, We depend on the environment to produce. So there is the whole discussion of more rains, less rains, water infiltration. We have the direct planting is for us to intensively cultivate the soil and keep it permanently covered. It is a recommended economic practice, and then it goes against water infiltration in the soil with the rains, because the non infiltration is uncovered soil, which limits infiltration and increases erosion. There's a whole disaster. That's what we used to live. I'm from southern Brazil back in the 70s when I was a child. I remember this clearly. The absolute erosions that used to happen on the streets. You could see the volumes of land of sands that came from the farms carrying producers' property. So there was a recommendation by Professor Ieda from Brazilia's Embrapa, and today I got rated in this area. I worked in the company for 28 years now, producing and improving more and more our system. I'm actually sad when I see the image that the productive sector has in the urban environment, especially Brazil's image abroad. Yesterday or today, the ambassador of Ambipar, Gisele, was saying that Brazil's image abroad is not good at all, and it isn't. But why? Because we are no longer we're not producing correctly. Of course, there are exceptions. When you consider 5 million producers in Brazil, now we are no longer taking care of some small aspects, and we allow for fires where they shouldn't exist. We are allowing the illegal opening of areas, and we're communicating this in an inefficient manner. So there's the image that is completely wrong of our production system in Brazil. I know because I see that the truth will prevail, and on a short term, we will radically change this image. And we do it correctly. The whole discussion, I saw a question on the screen. So the producer um, uses chemicals, but for the food production, it is a remedy for plants, the medicine for plants to control diseases and plagues. Like you take a medicine to avoid diseases. If you use more or use less, that's an agronomical issue. You have to use the right dose in the right time. If you don't use it, don't produce, and then there's no food. So there's a whole discussion on what 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 is proper for a producer. So when you have innovative technology, since the biological control, and it's been working pretty well on our farm and in Brazil, uh, so the producer wants more and more to have a sustainable production system in all aspects, socially, environmentally, and we should um, build this more and more and rebuild Brazil's image in the international market. And I do believe in the next few years we will be able to improve that image, and we have an internationally acknowledged production system as sustainably. So I don't think the system, the rain system, is going to change. For me to have our water infiltration, I need of I can have water seepage, protecting the soil. So that's why two things can work properly, because the proportion of the total area that was deforested is nearly 50%. In the degraded pasture area, there's no protection, and the water is, the soil is compacted. The rain comes and water runs away. It doesn't seep in the soil. If it is well managed and has a permanent coverage, when it rains, the water seeps and it doesn't accumulate in the river. So sustainable agriculture is possible, and it can match the environment preservation. And this reconstruction of image that you just talked about, in a great measure, it depends on legislation and inspection, right? Many people say that nearly everybody that I talk say that Brazil has managed to build a forest code that is pretty efficient. Now, we do have an inspection issue, which is chronicle, and we have some tools that are pretty important that are not being implemented, even with things that the productive sector needs. Maybe the clear model is the environmental registry. What is going on? How important? What is the exact importance of that tool? Because we know the production tool producers will have the information like more easily accessed by society in a whole. If they have to know the better condition of their supplier, they have to see who's going to continue in the activity or not. But does that hinder the process? Is the whole reconstruction process that Pavinato has talked about, Andre? The code, the forest code, is a Brazilian issue that placed Brazil in a very good leadership trajectory, because the rural registry, as it is in our model, we don't see it anywhere else. Maybe what we don't see is the issue of legal reserve. I haven't been able to find it the way we do. Each rural property needs to have 20, 35, 50, 80%. Now, actually, this delayed code implementation is turning into an issue for buyers, because the whole debate of zero deforestation, I'm convinced of that, it is pretty associated to the fact that the trust regarding the implementation of the code does not exist. It has become, we argue in its defense. I'm not talking about sectors that want to effectively they compete with Brazil. We hear this from our clients. Like they say, you do have a code, but nobody has ever been punished. Producers that were deforested illegally, they haven't been identified or punished. So this whole impunity thing is kind of a rule in Brazil for many things, for many sectors, and many activities. So for us, buyers that we buy agricultural products, we want to go talk to the guy, and well, the rural registry is okay, it is validated, they open X actors of area, they can open, and that's it. What we would build our system, and we say the soy I originate in this region has 100% of chemistry validated. If the deforestation was legal, verified by authorities, that many percent was with deforestation and in consolidated land. If there was an embargo, it would be disconsidered. So what we want is to centralize all the information right there, and the purchasing companies would see the registry, and producers would be interested in seeing the whole registry working. So it doesn't depend only on the producer. The producer has played its role. Of course, there are many issues. Mato Grosso is going through the experience of the number of registries. So there's been a delay. They want to catch up, but 9 years later. So for us, it's pretty bad. we're missing out on a great opportunity. If the code was fully implemented, we would be in a different standing in terms of image. Thank you, Andre. Before starting the live session, I said that 1.5 hour would fly. We're not going to go to the final remarks. So, Juliana, if you allow, Aurélio Pavinato will be first. Pavinato, your final remarks, please. Well, I always like to see the movie from a global perspective. When we go to COP 26, we have to think of the planet. When we discuss deforestation, we'll talk about this deforestation where we have to zero that in Brazil, but have to zero in other countries as well. So the question is, the world production system, is it able to grow in terms of productivity to account for the world demand in the next few decades? Okay, if not, how can we expand our production? Where to? And the discussion, when you think in the global level, you have to think of the whole picture. And you cannot conserve Brazil and conserve the African savanna. It's the same carbon, similar effect. So I reinforce that the international level discussion has got to be made, and it shouldn't be reserved to a single country. Simultaneously, in the Brazilian Cerrado, fortunately, we have technology, equipment, funds to grow and develop in our productive system more and more sustainably. So I am very optimistic that Brazil and the Brazilian Cerrado over the next few decades will play a very important role in a worldwide food supply, and also in demonstrating to the world that we can produce a lot using very few resources. And we can conquer this international acknowledgement that we do have a sustainable productive system. Meanwhile, we keep up production and productivity with a climate that is kept in terms of rain behavior, temperature behavior. Ludmila just talked about the increased temperature, transpiration, like loss of water. Producer has involved a lot in management. The soil profile, when you increase the water stock in the soil, you can use in moments of stress. So we improve the management of the culture as well, and you look for balance. But of course, when you avoid global warming, you avoid the complicated effects of that, and then you have more stability in your production anywhere in the world. So I'm very optimistic with our country. We have to do the right thing. There's a whole role of the state in inspecting who doesn't do the right thing. Those that burn illegally, and if we do everything that is legal in Brazil today, I see that it's just enough. It is enough, as André said. We can open 1 million, 2 million of native vegetation if we we include two cultures: soy, corn. We cut a forest, which is pretty demanded today. So this is compatible if you use knowledge and concepts that are pretty well developed and consolidated in Brazil in terms of agronomy, and you build a sustainable productive system. Thanks for having me. Well, thank you, Pavinato. Very nice to have you here in this debate. Pavinato is the president of SLC Agricola. If you don't know, it is one of the biggest producers of grains in Brazil. Thank you, Pavinato. André Nassar, por favor, your last words and your final comments. Well, very quick, three things here. We need to have total transparency of numbers. We need to produce public monitorings. We need to show outside Brazil what happens, especially when it comes to soy, which is our main crop. So we represent that in Brazil. We publish monitoring of deforestation since the 1819 crop. We'll be doing this yearly from now on. Secondly, it has to do with what Ludmila said. Producers have adopted good practices, but we can improve. There are many soil conservation things to be done. So two things here. First, we have to acknowledge the good practices, acknowledge the producer's role, which is, I mean, we have to give the merit to the technology that producers have brought in their farms, so to speak, and somehow encourage that. So in the consolidated areas, how can we encourage this even financially? How can we encourage the market to do this financially? And lastly, we need to demand from governments in the federal and state level to fight illegality, which in my opinion does fail. Government doesn't play its role, and then buyers have to monitor. And it looks like they want to inspect producers, but actually you just want to eliminate the risk of illegality in our chain. So there's a large failure, a big failure of federal and state governments that is not tolerable anymore. Thank you, Fernando. Thank you, Valor. Good to be with you guys, Juliana, Ludmila, and Aurelio. Thank you, Nassar, president of the Brazilian Association of Vegetable Oil Industries. Great to have you again, however, virtually. Thanks for joining us. Ludmila, Hachis, please make yourself at home for your final remarks.
It is very nice to having had the opportunity to be part of this debate because basically, maybe to following different paths, we are towards the same goal, which is preserving the native vegetation areas and producing, because it is important, but it is even more important in Brazil, especially in this post-COVID Brazil. And for this, we need three things. The first is to get to know the Cerrado and its particularities, because it is very different producing in the Cerrado in Minas Gerais or in the Cerrado in Mato Piba. We need to understand the differences in order to be able to produce in each of the inner regions of the Cerrado. And for this, these are all essential for us to reach our climate sovereignty. As Aurelio said, there's this one thing: the world needs to stop deforesting. It needs to stop with large carbon emissions. Of course, we have our own role. We don't have full control of this, but the way we mitigate it locally, we manage to do so. And this is what I am talking about when I mention climate sovereignty. We need to have this power so that Brazil can reach these 40% production. So thank you very much, Fernando, Juliana, André, Aurelio, and the whole organizing team of this event.
Thank you, Ludmila, for joining us. She is a researcher for the Global Climate Center. Sorry for my accent here. And the Environmental Research Institute in the Amazon, EPAN. Thank you for joining us, Ludmila. I'm going to make my final remarks as well. We had the fourth live out of 6 that are being made with Valor Econômico and Coalition. The master sponsor of those lives is JPS Net Zero 2040. For this live specifically, we also had the support of Nespresso. So I'd like to thank all of you, all those that watched us, our guests, and Juliana. Thanks for the partnership. Now over to you, Juliana.
Thank you very much, Fernando. Thank you very much to all of you for this discussion. It was very important to bring many debates onto the table. It was very good to be part of this very nice project, which is the Brazil Coalition Special for COP26. And I also have to leave a message to you. Please do not forget that we are going to have 6 events in total. And after those events, we are going to have a publication in Valor Econômico, a special supplement with 6 pages with a compilation of all of them. And we are also going to have a report with everything that we have discussed and a proposal for COP26. It's a very important moment, a moment that indicates actions through all sectors. And we are trying to be as plural as possible in these 6 events. And I hope you have enjoyed this event today. And I'll see you next time. Thank you very much.